Okay, I think for the sake of time, and for all of you who took out the time to join me, thank you so much for being here. I'm gonna go ahead and begin. This is very much an interactive discussion-based sort of conversation that we'll be having. I'm no expert in navigating institutional systems, but as a international student myself, um, I think we may have some shared experiences in terms of navigating these institutional systems. And so I really want to map out and put things into perspective about how international students are operating within the American higher education system. Um, and to start off today, I want to first acknowledge why we're here, right? Why are we even having this conversation? It's not just the four of us, the five of us, the six of us who are here, who have been or presently are international students. But there are over 1.2 million international students in the United States of America. And 90% of these are actually non-European, right? So there's this of Europe and North America shared experience. That's why we experience to a certain extent. But the interesting thing is that 90% of these international students in the United States of America are non-European, and they come from a vastly different culture, right? So something which is significantly different from what the American system or the American society is used to. So today's agenda and what we're going to talk about and the sort of the purpose of this entire conversation that we're having is that this is an attempt to acknowledge, empathize, and co-create solutions for international students who are presently navigating the American higher education experience. You don't need to be an international student yourself to act as an ally. And we know this from allyship literature and also allyship in action, um, about how diverse social identities can be brought together for a common cause, even if it does not directly impact your own social identity. And so today we're going to go through this conversation by acknowledging what are the challenges that international students face, what is the unique resilience and power that international students bring to the American system. Then we're going to sort of whine a bit about the bureaucracy in American institutions or higher education institutions in terms of the several forms that we have to fill, constantly needing to prove oneself as an international student and all of that. And then we're going to move on to something a little more constructive, which are what resources already exist out there. Of course, as you may be aware, there are official resources and unofficial resources. Oftentimes, oftentimes unofficial resources are community driven, and we're going to talk about that idea a bit. And then lastly, we're going to end with just some general strategies that can be employed to improve our international student experience um, here in the United States of America. And so I would like to start off with a brief activity inspired by Dr. Salibian's teaching, pedagogy, and style of teaching. I'm using this chat burst activity, which I would like you to think for 2 to 3 minutes about any one or two unique challenges that you face as an international student, if you are an international student, or if you were to imagine a close friend of yours who is an international student, what are some of the challenges you see that they face? Or what are the challenges that you perceive that they actually face on a regular basis? And then I would like you to type it out in the chat, but not post it. And after 2 to 3 to 4 minutes, I'm going to say, let's go. And I would like you all to press enter so we can see all the responses together. So take a few minutes to think about what are some unique challenges you or someone you know faces as an international student. Lovely. Okay, let's go. So from June, we have visa, mostly visa and work authorization related issues. From Nazia, mostly the living, transportation, and payment for our semester term, work authorization, OPT, etc. From Deja, Western Europe perspectives being treated as the norm, being translated into disrespect of non-US culture. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you all for sharing these. I mean, I feel like you're very on point with all the three things that I've just seen and read, are very aligned with what several international students face. From Dr. Salibian in the chat, we have, I'm not an international student, but I'm the daughter of immigrants who navigated their own challenges completing their PhDs after newly arriving in the US. Fast forward many decades, I witnessed many of our international CAFE, TNDUI scholars who have a double burden of the gatekeeping that already exists in academia made even more burdensome. Thank you so much, Sylvia. Yes, absolutely. And to speak and to add on to this idea of other norms being perceived as a disrespect in some way to US culture, um, and this idea of the double burden, it really talks about how first international students have to prove themselves in their own cultures. Um, and then once they make this sort of trip, arduous trip across several seas and oceans, um, they have to deal with this idea of proving themselves all over again in the eyes of a new sort of authority, which is now the American system. So thank you all for engaging in that little activity. And now, if I was to sort of talk about some of the literature that exists that has historically been able to study the international student experience and come up with identify sort of the brackets of challenges that students face. Um, and so in 2012, Gebhard, for example, they proposed that international students face three kinds of challenges: social, emotional, and academic challenges, right? And then in 2014, you had Messidor and Sly, who spoke about four types of adjustment that needs to be brought about specifically for international students and what they face, which is cultural, psychological, and academic adjustment, and also the idea of social adoption, which connects to exactly what you were saying, Deja, for example, about the idea of norms and how international students are required to take take upon the responsibility of adapting to these norms, right? And here on the right of this particular slide, you can see that this is a model of five primary challenges that were found by Yi et al. In 2003. Um, some people may argue that experiences of international students have changed, but sort of the core challenges continue to remain the same and continue to be an uphill battle even for students today in 2026, right? Um, so you can see that these are the five categories: academic systems, financial situation, physical health, vocational environments, and then personal and social issues. But I sort of wanted to take this a step forward and actually identify that for us as international students, as someone who identifies with this group, what are some of the specific elements within each of these challenges that are almost like sub challenges that emerge, that add on? There's a cascading effect of these smaller challenges, which turns into a much larger challenge. So the academic system is a much larger, it's an abstract, large challenge. But specifically, it's operationalized by the facilitation within the classroom being something that I'm not used to as an international student, for example, right? Or the grading mechanisms not being similar to the original culture that you actually come from, or not being able to understand the feedback given by the professors. These are all examples of how the academic system poses obstacles and challenges for us. And I think the most important, like we mentioned with the visas and the cost of things, is the financial situation, right? So in the United States of America, there's this idea of credit dependency, which may not always be the case in other cultures. In several cultures across the world, credit is almost seen as a problem of some sorts, and it hasn't been embraced in the same way. So it's interesting that here, when you come here, there's this idea of credit dependency, and it's something that we need to adapt to, right? And then, of course, looking at the current state of global affairs, this idea of conversion is always something which is on the back of our minds, right? Um, every couple of days, there's some notification or some news article or something about how your specific currency has changed with regards to the American dollar. And in most cases, historically, it's becoming worse and worse in terms of conversion. And then the third thing that I was thinking of was this idea of price comparison. We love to compare some international students often fall into this idea of like comparing the prices of food, for example, in the United States with the price of food back home. And that can often emerge as a major source of frustration, right? And then there's our physical health challenges and adaptations. The diet is completely different. There are differing levels of anxiety because of these physical health aspects that are emerging. Um, and then there's also this idea of adapting to the actual climate that you're in, right? So acclimatization is something that I think is underrated when we talk about physical health of international students. And this often poses a problem for several students, especially in the first few months of their international study. From Dr. Salibian in the chat, credit dependency has a negative connotation here as well, but many or most of us are conditioned to accept it as a necessary evil, much like many other things we are conditioned to normalize. Yes, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Salibian. I mean, I agree. But it's this idea of taking, yeah, yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I agree. And I think that in some ways, this idea of being dependent on an external thing, which is kind of controlling your expenditure and controlling the way you live your life, kind of a thing. So thank you so much for pointing that out. And then I want to highlight that in the vocational and in the work environment, in general, there are clear barriers and obstacles that emerge from language, right? Especially if English is not your primary language. There are several negative stereotypes associated with our specific identities depending on the countries that we come from. Um, and then there's a difference in working styles, right? And this can emerge again in several specific ways, like punctuality or the length of a conversation that you might have over Zoom or on call versus in person, right? So there are lots of different working styles, and this also poses a major challenge in general. And then, of course, there's this general idea of adjustment and this idea of isolation and loneliness, which remains one of the primary challenges at a primary and social issue level. So now I want to move on to this idea of why do we care about the international student and what is the power, right? So just to put things in context, a little bit, people who challenge this idea of how truly important and integral are international students and immigrants to the idea of America and the American economy. I think there is a lot of understated power of the international student. We contribute about $43 billion annually to the American economy just by our sheer presence in this country. There are over 355,000 jobs that we create and support on an annual basis, in specifically with the United States of America. And then for every three international students that are admitted to the United States of America, there's a job that is created in this economy in a sector that specifically benefits Americans as opposed to non-Americans. And so this is particularly interesting because people feel that international students or immigrants come in for this idea of selfish growth and to make money and send the money back home and things like that. But actually, our presence here is leading to job creation within the country itself. And of course, like I've mentioned, we inject vital revenue into the American economy. Um, and this actually leads to the notion of being able to help domestic students through their studies in the first place. So the excessive fees that are charged of international students are used to offset the tuition fees for domestic students, right? And this is, I mean, I'm not saying that international students should be clapped for doing that, but I'm saying that this is something that needs to be acknowledged, particularly by domestic students who may have benefited from our presence in this economy and in this society. And then, according to the National Foundation for American Policy, which is also known as NFAP, international undergraduate enrollment led to a higher number of STEM bachelor's degrees awarded to United States citizens or United States students. So the very presence, again, of international students in undergraduate environments has led to an increase in STEM degrees for American students, right? Which again shows you how there's a direct benefit to American society with the presence of international students. And now, if we were to go deeper into this idea of economy and economic impact, and what about the big companies and all of that, 25% of billion-dollar startups in the United States of America are actually founded by international student alumni, right? So this is again something very important to remember, that they made the most of one opportunity to study in a country to sort of help that country at such a scale, which contributes to almost 25% of any other person who was able to contribute at that scale, right? And of course, any international student in the United States acts as an ambassador for the US education system. Wherever you go back, it sort of becomes a tag associated with your name where you've been, and this increases visibility, particularly given how in several other cultures, the actual population is so much higher. So it's almost like a marketing tactics. That's why international students also work as ambassadors in some way. And then I was thinking of how can we sort of categorize this idea of what do we bring to the table, and looking at a lot of research that's already on there about what international students bring. I believe that international students bring in this idea of cultural competence, which stems just from the idea of multiculturalism and being aware of the existence of other cultures, which is particularly limited, I would say, in the American system, particularly for students who've never been able to leave the United States of America and have not been able to have those intercultural interactions with individuals from different cultures. And then, of course, there's clearly the diversity of perspectives that international students bring to the table, to the American classroom. And this has been imperative to drive innovation, for example, which again has led to huge, huge, huge success for the American economy. And most importantly, what we bring to the table is this idea of community, right? The idea of community in the United States is a little different, I would say, than it is in several other cultures. And I believe that this cultural pluralism sort of helps bring about greater community change and behavior change within the community, based on this diversity of perspectives. And I do want to shout out to this particular resource that I used for this, which was US for Success Coalition, which talks about what specifically international students, how they influence the American economy, and what the economy would look like without international students. So I'd briefly like to acknowledge some of the resources that exist out there for international students to navigate um, their journey in the United States and in the system, right? So there are some official resources which are almost things we have to abide by. There's no option. I promise you, if I option, I would not be citing ICE, but it is something that we have to adhere to immigration and customs enforcement law, as foreign nationals trying to enter the United States of America for the purpose of education. So the first resource is the Department of Homeland Security, which talks about different types of education statuses and how you can enter and what the different kinds of programs are. Then you have the SEVP, which is the Student and Exchange Visitor Program. As you all must be aware, our I-20s are kind of linked to this, and our identities, kind of as international students, are managed by ICE, and DHS. Um, and then, of course, at the local level, there's also, I mean, official things are not only at the federal level, you can also have official resources at other kinds of institutional levels. So at CGU here, we have the International Student Office, which Christine Kang and Joanna Abdullah have done a fantastic job with. They've been really useful and very helpful for me personally as well. Um, but it's kind of evident, despite all of these resources that exist, that there needs to be more resources for international students, particularly from like lived experiences of other students, right? Because lived experiences can vary vastly from what you think the experience is or what you think the experience should be. Right? So the law might say one thing, but how students actually experience it with other kinds of authorities within society is actually different. And that's where I want to bring in this idea of community-driven resources, right? These are things which are almost aggregated from the community level to create a cohesive place for people to come and seek help and support or just seek any kind of guidance, right? So just some shout outs here to the International Student Services Association, ISSA, which has worked extensively in the United States, but also in the UK, I believe. And then there's the NAFSA, Association of International Educators, which provides specific guidance on how to deal with the diversity of international students within the classroom. And then there's ISSF, which is the International Student Support Foundation. Again, these are all non-profit organizations. They don't particularly charge a fees if you ask them for help. And then there's the Community Sponsorship Hub, which is particularly for refugees that are sort of leaving undesirable situations in their home countries to come to the United States. So these are just a few examples, of course, a handful of examples of resources that exist at the community resource level. There's also this EAB, which was formerly the Education Advisory Board. And what they provide is actually very interesting. This is something I came across when I was preparing for this particular webinar. But it sort of provides universities with a checklist to help international students transition into the American higher education experience. So you can see, and I'm going to leave this up here for a minute while you're looking at it. It's this idea that there's no one size fits all solution. And so there should be at least 100 tactics that we should list that students can pick and choose from what they think is important. But more importantly, universities can pick and choose from for what is relevant to them, right? So just to run you through this, for example, on the left, you see there's pre-arrival preparation. It tells you how easy it is to do this online, any of these items, right? Orientation sessions for parents and families is one example. Virtual campus tours is another example, right? And then there are these post-arrival orientation things which can't be delivered online, and that requires physical presence. And it also gives you a level of standardization about how likely this is to work in different contexts, um, and whether or not those same things are actually relevant to the domestic students also or not. And this is kind of an efficient way for universities to streamline the integration between international and domestic students as well, because those places that are more standardized and that are more relevant to home students, they can sort of co-create with domestic and international students to achieve these objectives. On the right, you can see these are all students have been given. This is the second half of the same document. You can see at the bottom here, it goes up till 100 different tactics that you can look at. So there are tactics for employment and careers that you could include, right? For example, career panels with recently graduated international students, or a list of employers with a positive history of scaffold and improve the double burden that is placed upon international students to sort of prove themselves all over again in the American system. And then, of course, on the bottom right, you can see communicating across the international student journey. And that really has to do with this idea of how American English might be very different from the way other countries and citizens of other countries and nationals have learned English in those countries, and how to sort of make the English equitable and make our communication equitable across the international student journey. Now, I want to briefly talk about this idea of tackling the bureaucracy, right? We spoke about how there are so many forms, there are so many forms, there are so many forms. Before our arrival, right, from the idea of admissions to the visa process, to getting documents stamped, getting admitted to the United States, then preparing all your documents to prove that you live in the United States. And all of this is happening before you even actually started your educational journey, right? This again is a distinct challenge, which is why we also see higher levels of burnout in international students, is because of these reasons. So what can we do and how can we sort of get over and use this challenge in a constructive manner? I think my first piece of advice, again, this is based on literature, of course, but also on lived experiences, but the idea of financial planning in advance, the cost of forms and the cost of bureaucracy, while it helps in terms of building the society that we live in and the roads that we use and everything, all of that, the cost structure here is quite different from different countries that you may come from. So financial planning is more important in this particular context. It's very important to have international peer group discussions. I think this is something that we here at CGU could improve at, but also in general in the entire United States of America, we can have more international student discussions about shared experiences. And while this serves as an opportunity to for all of us to get together and sort of crib about some of these issues, it's also an opportunity to come up with constructive solutions and ways for us to navigate these issues in the first place. And then the third most important, and I think actually the most important aspect is this idea of advocating for institutional social support. And it kind of stems from the power that we have as international students, right? We actually bring a lot to the table. We're bringing in multiculturalism, which should not be understated as just the idea of different colors and different races, but really the idea of the diversity of ideas and innovation that we're bringing to the table. So I think it's critical for us to advocate for institutional social support and to seek it out as a right rather than someone else doing us a favor by doing that for us, right? And then I think the fourth, another thing that we can focus on is identifying student-led initiatives as opposed to institutional initiatives and institutional resources. And that's why we can work on building our own resources, for example, right? Then we could also build community, which kind of lends into this idea of peer group discussions, but building these smaller is actually a great way to acculturate into the United States system. And then I would like to point out that there are so many forms, like we mentioned, and fill all these forms, it feels like, wow, we've achieved some goal, right? And we make these forms and these approvals sort of our end point and our end goal. And I think that we need to reframe this idea of what our goals truly are and separate that from these forms and obstacles that exist to verify our status and things like that. So let's not confuse these forms and these requirements for our actual end goals. And here, I would like to take a few minutes, maybe 4 to 5 minutes, for us to create our own community resource list that I would like to sort of then send out to the larger student body at CGU and have them add to this as well. This is your opportunity to share. Some of you are international students, you've experienced this yourself firsthand. So you might have some resources from your end that you already used and that have been particularly useful for you. The rest of you, think about what resources could be useful or try to look for a resource right now that could be useful uh, for international students, at least here at CG. I'm going to paste this in the chat, and I would like you all to take 5 minutes and participate however much you feel comfortable, of course. Thank you all for adding. I see some very interesting resources in here. Um, I'm just going to list a few just to get an idea so all of us are on the same page. Supporting LGBT international students. This is a resource from NAFSA. Supporting the health and well-being of international students. This is a resource specifically from Timely Care, which is a health provider, mental health provider, um, and physical health provider, I believe. Um, then we have so this is interesting. We have financial advice here with a credit card application for a credit card company that is friendly with students who don't have credit history. That is one big challenge financially that students face is that because we don't have any particular credit history in this economy, we are considered as not eligible for a lot of credit-based things. And this can work, this is a challenge because, again, of the price of things in the United States in comparison to other countries they come from. Thank you so much for sharing all of those thoughts and ideas. I hope that we can turn this into an exhaustive list and keep working on it. This is going to be an evolving sort of resource. And it's not something that's just going to stop, hopefully, and we'll keep it going and we'll keep sharing updated versions with you all. So I would just like to now sort of conclude before we sort of open it up to any questions, and for all of us to spend a few minutes reflecting on this idea of and sort of hopefully coming to the same conclusion that it is your right as an international student to seek support. This accountability lies on students, colleagues, institutions, most importantly. But then again, there is some element of your willingness to advocate for yourself, uh, which is also something that needs to be built because it's not something that we necessarily learn again in the cultures that we come from because we may or may not have faced similar challenges in the past. Or the nature of the social dynamic is different, right? But here there is this sort of idea that you need to advocate for yourself in order for. So we need to take some partial responsibility for advocating for ourselves, but more importantly, we need to hold institutions accountable for the support that they're supposed to be giving us. Um, and then it leads me to this reflection question, which is if our goal is equity and opportunity in learning, how can we as educators ensure that international student space, right? What is it that you could do at an actual tangible level in your own classrooms that you think, or that you think in a classroom that you've been in, that you think could improve the international student experience? And with this, I'd like to sort of open it up discussion and we can have a conversation for maybe 5-10 minutes. I know we're ending a little early, uh, but I'm really excited to have this discussion and conversation with you. Thank you for listening.
Akshay, thank you so much for this presentation and for the interactive components involved. Last night in Cafe 430, we were talking about a slightly different demographic, but I think the main idea applies as well, is listening to international students instead of sort of talking above or over them in the same way, for example, listening to disabled students or listening to chronically ill students when they're telling you what they need or what they're striving for. With international students, the importance is to have them part of the conversation, and if not leading the conversation, so that I think is something that I will reflect upon further in terms of how to bring that into the classroom setting and into learning spaces in general.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Dr. Sylvian. I mean, I agree. I feel like there's become like this desensitization to the international experience just because of the number of international students that coexist in the system, where now it's almost like not perceived as an additional challenge or an obstacle, right? by those who are in the dominant group in this particular case, being domestic students. So yeah, I completely agree. I think there's been this desensitization, and this has led to a reduction in empathizing with the international student experience as well. Yeah, thank you so much for pointing it out. Any other thoughts? Yes, Daniel, I will share the slides. Absolutely. Um, I will also keep updating the spreadsheet, the CGU community-driven resources for international student spreadsheet. Um, so keep that sort of close in that sense. I will update it with all the references that I used in today's presentation. Separate tab for official resources that come from CGU's International Student Office, right? What all support do they provide, and specific links to all those resources. Uh, but yeah, yeah. Yes, Dr. Sullivan.
I'm wondering, does CGU, the International Student Office, or another office have like up to the minute updates on bills, current events, restrictions that would impact international students? Because there have been many, especially in recent years. Is there a way to have like, very timely updates? Because that affects travel plans, it affects mental health, it affects all sorts of components to one's academic and personal life.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dr. Silibin. I actually don't know if our international student office has a resource like that. Um, what I've been deferring to personally is the DHS website for any notification that comes out. Um, it's tough, right? Because even the international student offices are facing a unique set of challenges with the current sort of way in which things are being run. Um, and so they're not able to make announcements because those announcements can sometimes be jarring for international students. And so they sort of try to stay away from making those announcements. But then they don't make those announcements, so we don't really know what's going on until we read about it in like some external third party thing. Um, and I don't think I have a clear solution for that. But I think that's a great idea in terms of maybe we should look for resources for students. I'm sure there must be some community-driven thing which already exists for updates for international students. I'll definitely take a look at that. Would anyone else like to share any thoughts? Going once, twice.
Akshay, will the link to the slides be in the YouTube when the video is uploaded?
Yes, yes. Yes. And I think in the post webinar email also we made. Yeah. Yeah. Okay then. Thank you all for joining. It was lovely. I feel like I did a lot of talking, but thank you all for bearing with me and for listening. Um, I'm always keen to have discussions with other international students about their experiences and how we can move forward constructively. So please feel free to reach out to me. I will share all of these other references that we spoke about today. And here is my contact information. I'm a CAFE fellow at CGU, and you can reach out to me via email, and I'd love to keep chatting. Thank you for joining.